Welcome to Free Science Fiction Stories. Today's story is Fog of War. When punishment duty turns into a deadly test of survival, Cade Jansen and Dr. Martell must navigate the wreckage of an alien-infested urban wasteland in this pulse-pounding military sci-fi short story.
Fog of War. Cade adjusted the grip on his rifle. The flamethrower attachment mounted below the barrel made it awkward to hold, his boots making barely a whisper against the cracked pavement, the sound swallowed by the dense fog curling through the ruins. The sky above was a muted orange, its glow diffused by the thick haze, remnants of distant fires, and past orbital strikes bleeding through in flickering embers. The air felt heavy, damp, carrying the scent of scorched metal and decay. Somewhere beyond the shifting mist, a faint, deliberate whistle drifted through the ruins. Not wind. Cade and the others were beginning to understanding the cost of disobeying orders. They knew there would be a price. And this was just the first payment. But they'd all do it again. Jansen, moving just behind him, went still. "That's them," he muttered. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the sound felt too loud in the crushing stillness. Dr. Martell checked the scanner mounted to her wrist. The screen flickered, the signal distorted by the wreckage around them, but the data was clear. A large biosignature, unmoving, roughly 70 meters ahead. The heavy-class Whistler. She exhaled slowly. "We found it." They crept forward, weapons at the ready. Each step was calculated, precise. Their orders were simple: take the target down and retrieve a viable tissue sample. The problem was, Command didn't send them with the gear meant to fight something this big. That was part of the punishment. Last mission, the rules of engagement forbade the use of explosives. They had broken those rules to get out alive. Now the higher-ups were extracting their revenge. They moved into the next block of ruins, where an abandoned transit hub sat partially collapsed, its skeletal supports bending inward like broken ribs. The target was inside. The building's structure was failing. Chunks of the ceiling had caved in, and thick roots from nearby growth had begun swallowing sections of the concrete. Jansen unhooked his scope, peering through the dim wreckage. He sucked in a breath. Just look at it. The creature was motionless, a hulking mass of plated armor and grotesque organic growth, fused with pieces of the ruins like it had made the city part of itself. It radiated stillness, but Cade had seen Whistlers before. Still didn't mean dead. It was larger than any they'd seen before. The usual Whistlers moved with insect-like precision, but this thing looked different, heavier, more solid, like something that had no intention of running. Dr. Martell barely whispered, "How do we kill that thing?" Cade took a slow breath. They weren't going to get a second shot at this. "Incendiaries," he said. "We crack its armor and burn it down." Jansen readied to take the shot, steadying his rifle on a burned-out car. "I hate this job." He took the shot, the bullet biting deep into its armor. The moment it struck the plating, everything changed. It began as a low, droning whistle that suddenly shifted into something sharp, something urgent. The sound reverberated through the structure, a frequency that rattled their bones. Something deeper in the ruins answered. The giant Whistler moved. Limbs uncoiled, unnatural joints twisting as it lifted its massive bulk from the wreckage. A thick layer of dust cascaded from its armored plating, revealing bioluminescent streaks pulsing beneath its exoskeleton. For a single horrifying moment it just watched them. Then it charged. The Whistler moved faster than anything that size had a right to. 1 second it was a statue in the ruins, the next it was hurtling toward them like a landslide. Cade barely had time to react before the massive bulk of the creature crashed forward, its plated limbs carving through the wreckage with terrifying ease. The ground shook beneath them, the impact sending cracks racing through the pavement like veins of splintered glass. He threw himself aside, hitting the ground hard as the creature's forelimbs slammed into the concrete where he had stood just moments before. A deafening shockwave tore through the ruins, sending chunks of metal and stone raining from above. Jansen barely had time to dive for cover before a section of the crumbling overpass gave way. A cascade of broken steel beams and shattered masonry plummeted down, barely missing them as the dust swallowed the world in a thick, choking cloud. Cade rolled onto one knee, coughing, his visor adjusting to the swirling debris. He could barely make out the Whistler's massive form through the settling dust, but its whistle cut through the chaos, loud, sharp, grating. A call. They didn't have time. Jansen hit the ground hard, skidding behind a collapsed slab of concrete. "We are so screwed." Martel took a step back, eyes locked on the beast, her fingers tightening around her sidearm like a useless comfort. "We need to burn it now or we're dead." They couldn't kill it with gunfire, that much was clear. The bullets had barely phased it, bouncing off its armored hide like pebbles against steel. Real fire was their only option. Cade readied his flamethrower, the pilot light flickering in the dim haze as he locked onto the exposed biomass beneath its armored plating. If they could get enough fire inside, they could cook it from within. "Jansen, I need a clean shot." Jansen swore, but complied, switching to his standard rifle, adjusting his aim in a split second. He fired a controlled burst into the creature's sensory cluster. The bullets didn't kill, but they did their job, forcing the Whistler to flinch. A pause, a hesitation, a single second. Cade took his chance. He unleashed a jet of fire. The liquid fuel ignited, clinging to the beast's exposed tissue, spreading in a wave of orange and blue. The creature shrieked, its distorted whistle warping into a high-pitched metallic keen that sent a chill through Cade's bones. Martel took the opening, firing into the burning gaps, her shots punching through the weakened armor. The Whistler twisted violently, its limbs convulsing as its plating cracked and peeled away, revealing more of the vulnerable biomass beneath. Cade kept the flame steady, sweeping it across the widening wounds, watching as the fire spread deeper, eating through the creature's internal structures. The heat was intense, even from this distance. Life-fying biomatter, fusing broken plating to charred muscle. The Whistler staggered, its movements growing erratic. It tried to run. Cade didn't let it. Another blast of fire, a final surge of heat and fury, and the creature collapsed. Its body smoldered, twitches running through its dying limbs as the last of its whistles faded into silence. For a few long moments no one moved. The only sound was the crackling flames, the occasional pop of charred plating splitting apart. The stench of burning flesh and scorched metal filled the air, thick and suffocating. Jansen wiped sweat and grime from his visor, exhaling sharply. That was a nightmare. Martel didn't answer. She moved fast, kneeling beside the still-burning corpse, grabbing a handful of dust from the rubble and smothering the flames where she needed to cut. The Whistler's body was still hot, the heat warping the air above it. She worked quickly, her blade cutting deep into the softened tissue. A wet, sickening noise filled the air as she extracted a glowing sample from the core. The organic mass pulsed faintly, its bioluminescence flickering like a dying star. She sealed it in the containment case, her hands shaking slightly. Then, a new sound. A whistle. Distant, long, measured, calling to the one that had been silenced. Jansen's grip on his weapon tightened. "They know." Cade glanced toward the fog-drenched ruins ahead, where shadows shifted beyond the mist. "Then we need to go, now." The fog thickened as they moved deeper into the ruins, curling between collapsed buildings and twisted steel like a living thing. Every step felt slower, more deliberate, as if the mist itself was dragging them down. Cade led the way, rifle raised, his HUD struggling to mark clear paths through the shifting haze. The extraction point was 4 clicks away. That wasn't far. But in this hellscape, it might as well be on the other side of the planet. Jansen adjusted his grip on his rifle. This fog wasn't this bad when we came in. Martel glanced at the containment case strapped to her chest. The sample inside pulsed faintly, casting strange shadows in the mist. I don't like this, Cade exhaled, pushing forward. We don't have time to like it. Then a whistle, long, drawn out, not a hunting call, a signal. Another answered from behind them. Jansen stopped walking. They're bracketing us. Hemming us in. Before Cade could signal a change of course, the fog erupted. A whistler lunged from the mist, twisting mid-air, its limbs splaying. Jansen fired instinctively, his rifle tearing into its side, but the creature absorbed the impact. Then a second one dropped from above, claws raking the concrete as it landed inches from Martel. Cade moved fast, firing a burst into its flank. The creature twisted, dodging the worst of the shots, whistling sharply as it rebounded into the fog. They weren't fighting like before. They were testing them, waiting. Jansen swore. They're playing with us. Martel's voice was tight. Yes, testing us. Hit-and-run tactics. The fog shifted, revealing an open clearing, a collapsed highway junction with no cover. They had been maneuvered into an exposed position. The whistles changed. Sharper, urgent. More were coming. Cade's jaw tightened. Run. They broke into a full sprint, dodging through broken support beams and shattered roadways. The fog distorted movement, turning shadows into looming figures. Martel nearly tripped as a whistler appeared just to her left, limbs unfolding to their full length. It whistled low, tilting its head before lunging. Cade pivoted, firing his flamethrower in a sweeping arc. The creature recoiled instantly, shrieking as fire licked across its exoskeleton. It rolled away into the mist, its body convulsing. Jansen grabbed Martel's arm, pulling her forward. Keep moving! The whistles grew erratic, spreading through the ruins. A signal to all nearby whistlers. Then Cade saw it, an opening ahead, a collapsed tunnel. Their best chance to break line of sight. He hoped there wasn't something worse inside. The tunnel stretched into pitch-black emptiness, silent except for the distant dripping of water. Jansen exhaled, resting his head against the wall. That was too close. Martel was still gripping her weapon too tightly, her fingers trembling. Cade listened to the silence outside. No whistles, no movement. They didn't follow us, he murmured. Jansen frowned. Why? Martel's voice was quiet. Because we're right where they wanted us. Cade stared down the darkened tunnel, pulse steadying. The whistlers had already done their job. The team was trapped. And something was waiting ahead. The fog had thickened into a wall of shifting gray, curling through the ruins in unnatural patterns. The team pressed forward, their steps sluggish, bodies aching from the last battle. The industrial district loomed ahead, a drowned skeleton of forgotten industry, half submerged in stagnant floodwaters. This is the only route to extraction, Jansen muttered, wiping sweat and grime from his visor. Unless you want to take the long way through the heavily infested zone. Yeah, Cade said, adjusting his rifle. They didn't have the time. Martel checked the containment unit strapped to her chest. The sample pulsed faintly, casting eerie shadows in the mist. We're close. Let's keep moving. Then, a whistle. Not the distant aimless calls from before. Another answered close by. A third, higher pitched, from ahead. Surrounding them, Cade's jaw clenched. They'd been following us this whole time. Martel's breath hitched. They're setting up an ambush. A perfect trap. The factory ahead was their only option. A rusted-out husk of metal and glass, its interior collapsed into itself. The jagged remains of support beams jutted from the murky water. Jansen pulled up short. They want us in there. They're forcing us into a kill zone. Cade exhaled sharply. Then we turn it against them. They moved quickly, pushing into the flooded ruins. The water was ankle-deep, thick with oil and debris. Movement was sluggish. Sound carried. It was the worst possible place to fight. Another whistle, closer, more urgent. Martel knelt down and messed the oily substance on the ground. "I think this is flammable," she said. "Good," Cabe responded. "We can use that." The whistlers didn't charge in immediately. One shadowed the perimeter, just out of sight, but close enough that Cade could hear the wet movement of limbs brushing against the metal. Another moved through some water, slow, deliberate, almost silent. The last gave a single, drawn-out whistle before dropping into the factory. The attack began. The first whistler lunged from the shadows. Jansen fired, catching it just below the head. It staggered but didn't fall, its body twisting, adjusting. He kicked it in the midsection, shattering its carapace. His armored boot trapped in the creature. "Sick," Jansen said in disgust, trying to shake the thing loose. He succeeded with a power armor-enhanced kick that sent it flying into a nearby post, shattering its back. Cade used the last of his flamethrower fuel to light the oily substance nearby. It erupted in a wave of fire and heat. One dropped down near Martel. She spun, firing point-blank into its chest, the impact sending it stumbling back into the fire. The last one tried to escape, leaping onto an overhead walkway. Jansen tracked it, fired, sending it crashing down into the inferno. The air filled with shrill, broken whistles, their patterns erratic, desperate. The fire consumed everything. Cade didn't wait for the flames to finish. "Move, now!" They pushed through the back of the factory, dodging falling debris, smoke curling around them. Heat made every breath feel like inhaling ash. Then, finally, they reached the extraction zone. The dropship was waiting, its thrusters kicking up dust and fog as the ramp lowered. They stumbled aboard, sealing the hatch behind them. Jansen collapsed against the bulkhead, breathing hard. That was the worst. Martel clutched the containment unit, staring at the faint glow inside. Cade just watched the burning factory shrink beneath them as they ascended. The ruins were already swallowing the flames as if nothing had ever happened. They had survived again. Command would be disappointed. The medical bay smelled of antiseptic and burned fabric, a sharp contrast to the smoke and blood still clinging to Cade's gear. The dim lights hummed overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow over the cramped room. Cade sat on the edge of the exam table, his joints aching, his body heavy with exhaustion. He barely registered the sting of the medic cleaning a cut along his temple. His focus remained locked on the containment case on the nearby console. The Whistler's sample pulsed faintly inside its reinforced casing, casting weak, flickering shadows against the wall. Martel sat across from him, her arm wrapped in fresh bandages, the dried blood on her sleeves a stark reminder of how close things had gotten. She rubbed at her forehead, her expression unreadable. Jansen stood near the doorway, arms crossed, his uniform still streaked with soot and grime. He didn't bother sitting. Too much adrenaline. Too much anger. A command officer stood before them, silent, scanning the debrief report. His eyes flicked across the data on his pad, his expression unreadable. That was it. No recognition, no praise. Jansen scoffed. "You're welcome, sir." The officer didn't even look at him as he walked out. The door hissed shut behind him, leaving the room quiet except for the distant hum of medical equipment. Martel let out a slow breath, shaking her head. "They already have another mission planned, don't they?" Kay didn't answer immediately. He just kept watching the glowing sample, the pulsing light reflecting in his tired eyes. "We disobeyed orders," he finally said. His voice was even, steady. "There are consequences for that sort of thing." Jansen let out a dry laugh. "Yeah? You think Command cares about consequences? We saved our own butts. That should count for something." Cade looked up at him. "It doesn't. Not to them anyway." Martel leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling. "This war's going to be long." Cade nodded. "And if we're lucky enough to see the end of it," he exhaled slowly, "it'll be because we did what we had to." The glow from the containment case pulsed again, faint, rhythmic. None of them spoke after that.
Enjoy this story? Subscribe to Free Science Fiction Stories for daily sci-fi adventures.